So what is a callback function? A callback function is a function passed into another function as an argument, and we usually do this to fulfill some action. In order to understand this, let us see some examples. So right here we are defining a function called greeting, and we are passing a name as an argument, and then right here we are able to alert that name. So we'll be having something like hello Charles, depending on the name that we enter. Let us define another function, and basically we are using this function to collect a name from a user using a prompt. The user will get please enter your name, then they'll enter the name, and we will store that name in memory using this variable name. But now interesting, here we have what we call a callback. We are passing an argument here or a parameter, and then we are calling it later on after getting the name. So here is the complete code, and you'll see that the argument that we pass to this function is this greeting function, this right here. So we are basically passing a function as an argument into another function, and now this is what we call a callback, and that is why now here we are just calling it callback. And what we are doing, we are calling it later on after getting our name, and we are passing that name right here. Now whatever we get, it's an alert of hello and the name that we enter. And this callback is an example of synchronous callback because it will be called immediately. So immediately after getting the name, we will call it and then it will alert us. So it doesn't take time to process. So this is what we call synchronous callback. We have many other examples of synchronous callbacks in JavaScript, and we'll mainly see them in array methods. A good example is the for each. So in the for each array method, you can see that we are passing this function as an argument. So this is another function that we are passing in here, and it will be called for each of the items during iteration. And we have many other array methods that work in a similar way, like the .map array method, the .reduce, and so on. So these are examples of synchronous callbacks. So in this video, we will be mainly checking at asynchronous callbacks, and in future videos, we will compare these asynchronous callbacks with promises and also async await, because basically they try to accomplish the same thing. To await for some data, for example, when fetching data from an API, and then when the data is ready, we use these callbacks, promises, or async await to tell the program that now the data is ready and we can make use of that data. So internal implementation of JavaScript of asynchronous callbacks, you'll see them in the fetch API, which we use to fetch data from an API. So this is a very good example of asynchronous callback in JavaScript, and now we can see how we can create our own callback in some more examples in code, and let's do that. So here I'm in VS Code, and I'm logging start and end to the console, and right here the terminal we have start and end. I'm using Nodemon to run the script. So I want us to see an example of asynchronous callback. So right now we have these two, and I want to stimulate some code that takes some time to process. So right here I'm going to add this set timeout, and in this set timeout we are passing a function, and actually now this is a callback in set timeout because we are passing a function as an argument of set timeout, which is also a function. And then I'll execute this code after 0 milliseconds. And what do you expect to see at the console? So you might expect that we will have start, then middle, then end, but that will not be the case because this set timeout creates some delay. So if I happen to save this, you'll see that we'll have start, end, and then middle as the last one. So right here you can actually specify more time. We can have like 3000 milliseconds, and now when I save this, you'll see start, end. After 3 seconds we get middle. So you'll see that this code is taking some time to process, and we will use this to stimulate an array of maybe fetching data from an API. So right here I'll define a function that we can use maybe to fetch data from an API. So I'll say function I'll call it fetch user. We will have set timeout in here, so I'll cut this and include it in here. So we'll assume this is a process that is taking some time to fetch data from the API. So right here, let's say getting user, and then we can return something here. Let us return an object. We will return an object with a user ID. So this is only the information that we get from the API. Okay, we don't have a real API, we are just assuming. So right here, if I happen to log this function to the console, so I'll say fetch user and we invoke it, we expect to get back this user ID object. But if I save, you'll see that actually we have an issue. Console is not a function. Okay, console.log here, sorry. So if I save this, you'll see that we get undefined. Okay, so whatever is happening is that JavaScript is executing the code line by line, and when we get to this point, it will call this function, and at that point this function doesn't have any return. Yes, it has a return here, but this will not be called immediately because it is not ready. It will be ready after 3 seconds. Therefore, this will give us undefined, and then after some time is when that return will be ready, and if we happen to call that function at that time after 3 seconds is when we will get back our data. But now how do we do that? So this is what callbacks try to solve in asynchronous code, and also things like promises and async await. So we are able to wait for data to get back, and once it's ready, we are able to alert our program that this data is ready and now you can make use of it. Okay, so let's see how we can implement this. So right here, we can basically just call our function normally, and then we will be passing a function right here. So we will pass a function, and now this function is our callback function. So we are passing a function inside another function, and we will be able to receive it here, and we will call it callback. You can give it any name, but callback makes more sense. And then later in code, after we fetch our data, let's assume here we are fetching data, then when the data is ready, we will call our callback. Okay, so right here we are able to call our callback, and we will pass this data as argument of this callback. So we'll be able to receive this data as argument right here. So here we'll basically have our user, and we can now make use of this user in here. So right here I can say console.log of user, and we can say that this is the user data. Okay, so user data like this. So if I now save this, you'll see that we are able to receive back our user ID here after 3 seconds. So if I save this, you'll see start end. After 3 seconds we get getting user, and then user data, we get it right here. So what we have done is that we have passed this function as an argument of fetch user, and then we are able to receive it here and call it later on after we fetch the data. So when the data is ready, we call our callback and we pass our data in there, and therefore we receive this data right here, and we can make use of that data right here. Okay, so our user is having our user ID. Now let's assume that we want to make use of this data in another function. Maybe we want more details about this user. For example, maybe the user profile. Maybe user profile has more details like address, name, and so on, and we want to make use of user ID to fetch more data. So we can chain callbacks. So we can call many callbacks inside each other. So right here, I can just come here, copy this. Let us define another function that will make use of set timeout to stimulate some code that takes some time to process. And right here, we will fetch our user profile. which we are assuming has more details about this user. Then we will be getting the user profile here, and this will also take about 3 seconds to get it. Then right here we will have more details about the user. We will have the ID, we will have the name, maybe Charles. We can also have maybe the address of this person, address, so let's just say Africa. And now we need to make use of the user ID, maybe to get these more details about this user. So here maybe we need to have a user ID, so user ID, and we will get the user profile using the user ID. So right here, when calling now this function, we need to call it inside our fetch user, inside this callback, so that we can be able to make use of this user ID, okay, since we need it to get our user profile. Okay, so right here we will be calling our fetch user profile. We will invoke it, and the first thing that we will do, we will pass a callback so that we are able to get back our details later on. So right here we pass a callback, and this callback now will be received here, and then when we get the data, we will be able to pass that data to this callback. Therefore here we will be able to receive the data, and that data will be this one here, and we can be able to log this data to console. So I can say console.log of our data, and let's have data. Okay, and another thing, remember, we need to pass a second parameter, which is our user ID, so that we are able to get this user profile. So right here we can have our user ID. Remember, this user is an object that will have this here. So we pass that ID, we get it here, and then here we will use it to fetch, okay, to fetch the profile, and we'll make use of that user ID. So let's save this and see what happens. Okay, so I save, we'll have start and end, and then after some time we get our user, and then after some time we get our user profile, and we get all the data. So you see, we are able to chain our callback. So we have a callback, and then inside this callback we are calling another function, and we are calling another callback here, and this process can continue on and on and on and on. So let's assume that we are now making use of this user and the user profile data to do some more processes. So what we could have is that we could chain more right here, and I can just copy this right here. We can have more like that, and if I save, you'll see it will all work out. We'll be able to fetch the data in a step-by-step manner. We get the user, we get the user profile after some time, and then we get the user again after some time, and we get the user profile after some time. So we are just chaining this, and this chain can continue more and more, and it can be so deep that this code becomes so hard to read. Okay, so this code becomes complex, and this is what we usually call the callback hell. And we usually have a solution for this, and the solution is using promises or async await, and that is what we will be checking next. So if you want to see us refactor this code using promises and also using async await, make sure to check the next videos. So make sure to subscribe and turn on post notification, and you'll await for those 2 videos, and then we can compare callbacks with promises and async await. So I hope this video was helpful, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.